Look at this. Every temple, every tomb, every period, every obelisk, covered floor to ceiling in writing. Thousands of years of history, poetry, prayers, laws, love letters, carved into every surface the Egyptians could find. The most written civilization in the ancient world. A society so obsessed with recording itself that they inscribed their words into stone that would outlast everything else they built. And then one day, the last person alive who could read any of it died. And for the next 1,400 years, the entire world just walked past it. Tourists, conquerors, scholars, priests, they stood in front of thousands of years of human thought carved into perfect detail into walls that had survived empires. And they had absolutely no idea what any of it said. Welcome to the Airlearn Language Show. There's something about this story that I find almost unbearable to think about. Imagine the entirety of written English, every book, every law, every letter, every poem, becoming unreadable overnight, not destroyed, still there, perfectly preserved, but locked. That's what happened to hieroglyphics. And the story of how they were unlocked is one of the great intellectual detective stories in human history, involving a French emperor, a stolen stone, a rivalry between two brilliant men, and a breakthrough so elegant it almost seemed too simple. But before we get to the unlocking, we need to understand the lock. Airlearn is built around this exact kind of thing, the story behind the language, not just the language. Worth a look. Links in the description. Now, Egypt. Hieroglyphics are old, genuinely, staggeringly old. The earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions we've found to date, around 3,200 BCE, over 5,000 years ago. That makes hieroglyphics one of the oldest writing systems in human history. For the next 3,500 years, Egyptians wrote in hieroglyphics continuously, on temple walls, on papyrus, on coffins, on jewelry, on the walls of tombs, sealed so tightly that the pigment of the paint is still vivid today. But hieroglyphics were never the only writing system in Egypt. They were the formal, sacred, monumental script, the one you used when you wanted something to last forever, when you were addressing the gods or commemorating a pharaoh. Alongside them, Egyptians developed faster, more practical scripts for everyday use. Hieratic, which was hieroglyphic simplified for writing on papyrus with a brush, and later, Demotic, an even more abbreviated script for administrative and commercial documents. So how does a writing system that was in continuous use for over 3,000 years become unreadable? The answer is slowly, and then all at once. Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took control and established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic rulers were Greek. Their court was Greek. The language of power and administration shifted gradually towards Greek. But hieroglyphics survived. The temples kept their priests, the priests kept their knowledge, and the sacred writing system continued. Then, Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BCE after the death of Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic ruler and, notably, reportedly, the only member of her dynasty who actually bothered to learn Egyptian. Under Roman rule, Egypt's ancient religious institutions slowly lost their support and the resources. The temples that had housed the priests who maintained the knowledge of the hieroglyphics were gradually closed, repurposed, or fell into disrepair. And in 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued an edict closing all pagan temples throughout the empire. The last functioning Egyptian temples, the last places where a knowledge of hieroglyphics was still being actively maintained, were shut. 3 years later, in 394 CE, someone carved a hieroglyphic inscription on the temple wall in Philae. We know the exact date because it was recorded alongside the inscription. It is the last known hieroglyphic inscription ever made. After that, silence. The priests who could read it were gone. The tradition that had transmitted the knowledge across 3,000 years was broken. For the next 14 centuries, the world did not lack for theories about what hieroglyphics meant. It had too many of them, and almost all of them were wrong in exactly the same way. The problem was a philosopher named Hieroglyphics, who in the 5th century CE wrote a text called the Hieroglyphica, purporting to explain Egyptian symbols. Hieroglyphics' explanation was that hieroglyphics were symbolic, that each image represented an idea or a concept, not a sound. An eagle meant soul, a serpent meant eternity. Each symbol was a philosophical statement, a piece of ancient mystical wisdom encoded in picture form. This idea proved almost impossible to kill. It fit too well with what educated Europeans wanted to believe about ancient Europe, that it was a civilization of profound and secret wisdom, that its writing was a kind of encoded philosophy accessible only to innate. An eagle here means the soul ascending. A serpent there represents the eternal nature of the divine. None of it was real. All of it was wrong. But it was wrong in a way that felt profound, and that made it very hard to dislodge. Meanwhile, the actual answer, the thing that made hieroglyphics readable, was sitting there in plain sight if anyone had known where to look. Hieroglyphics were not pictures representing ideas. They were sounds representing speech. They were phonetic. But for 1,400 years, no one could see it. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. The military campaign was, by most measures, a failure. But Napoleon brought with him not just soldiers, but scientists, a team of scholars, artists, and researchers tasked with documenting everything they found. And in August of 1799, a French soldier digging fortifications near a town called Rashid, which Europeans would call Rosetta, hit something with his shovel. Stone. Dark granodiorite, about the size of a coffee table. Broken at the top, so the original must have been even larger. Covered in writing. 3 different scripts, arranged in parallel sections. At the top, hieroglyphics. In the middle, Demotic. At the bottom, Greek. The French scholars recognized immediately what they might have. If all 3 sections said the same thing, and Greek at least was readable, then this stone could be the key to unlocking the other 2 scripts. The British defeated the French in Egypt shortly after, and under the terms of surrender, the Rosetta Stone was handed over to the British. It has been in the British Museum ever since, a fact that Egypt has never stopped pointing out and Britain has never stopped ignoring. But not before the French made meticulous copies. The race to decode it was about to begin. The Greek text was read almost immediately. It was a priestly decree issued in 196 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy V, recording the honors granted to the king by the Egyptian priesthood. But it named names. It named the king. It named specific places and specific people. And those names, the scholars realized, would have to appear in the hieroglyphic section too. Names don't get translated. They get transliterated. The sound of a name has to be represented somehow. This was the crack in the wall. 2 men working largely separately and in intense competition drove their chisels into that crack. Thomas Young, an English polymath so extravagantly talented that he is sometimes described as the last man who knew everything, and Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar who had been obsessed with Egypt since childhood and had taught himself Coptic, the late form of the Egyptian language still used in the Egyptian Christian Church, specifically because he suspected it might be the key to reading ancient Egyptian. Young got there first in some respects. By 1819, he had identified that a cartouche, an oval loop that appears around certain hieroglyphic groupings, marked a royal name. He had correctly identified some of the phonetic values of specific hieroglyphs with those cartouches, but he still believed that the phonetic system was limited, used only for foreign names and loan words, and that the majority of hieroglyphics were still symbolic in Hieropolo's sense. He was wrong about that, and Champollion saw why. Champollion's breakthrough came in 1822, and it came precisely because of his knowledge of Coptic. Coptic, the language of the Egyptian Christian Church, is a late form of Egyptian language written in Greek letters, with a few additional characters for Egyptian sounds that Greeks couldn't represent. Nobody had connected it to the ancient writing system because nobody had imagined that the language itself might be the same. That modern Egyptian Christians were still, in a sense, speaking the language of pharaohs. Champollion had. And when he worked through the phonetic values and hieroglyphs and compared the resulting sound to Coptic, something clicked into place. The words matched. The grammar matched. The language of hieroglyphs and the language of Coptic were not just related. They were the same language, separated by time and script, but fundamentally continuous. On September 14th, 1822, Champollion walked into his brother's office in Paris, handed him a stack of notes, and said, "I've got it," and fainted. He had been working so intensely for so long that the breakthrough broke him temporarily. He was 31 years old. What he had understood, the thing that unlocked 3,000 years of writing, was this: hieroglyphics were not pictures representing ideas. They were a mixed system, phonetic at their core, representing the sounds of Egyptian language. Some signs were phonograms representing sounds. Some were determinatives, category markers that clarified meaning without adding sound. Some were logographs, representing whole words. But the foundation, the thing that made the system work, and the thing that Harapolo had completely missed, was phonetic. Hieroglyphics were writing, not art. They worked the way all writing works, by encoding speech. Once you have that key, the locks open everywhere, simultaneously. Within years of Champollion's breakthrough, scholars were reading texts that had been silenced for 1,400 years. Medical papyri detailing surgical procedures of startling sophistication. Religious hymns of extraordinary beauty. Love poetry, genuine, intimate, personal love poetry, written by people who had been dead for 3,000 years and were suddenly, shockingly present again. One of the most famous early translations was a poem from the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE, in which a young woman writes about her longing for a man she loves. The images she uses, the distraction, the physical symptoms of desire, the way his face appears in her mind unbidden, are so recognizable, so contemporary in their emotional texture, that reading it for the first time can produce something close to vertigo. 3,000 years. Same feeling, same words. That's what the silence had swallowed. Not mystical symbols, not encoded philosophy. People, real people with real feelings who wanted to be remembered. And then there's the irony at the center of this entire story. The Rosetta Stone, the artifact that had unlocked 3,000 years of human expression, is not a poem. It is not a prayer. It is not the wisdom of pharaohs or the secret of the ancient world. It is a tax document. Specifically, it is a decree establishing the tax exemptions and religious privileges of the Egyptian priesthood under Ptolemy V, the greatest key in history of linguistics. The artifact without which an entire civilization would have remained mute. A priestly memo about tax breaks. There is something almost perfect about that. 3,000 years of history, of art, medicine, poetry, engineering, love, war, and prayer. Unlocked not by a great sacred text, but by the most mundane document imaginable. Because mundane documents are exactly the kind of thing that gets written in triplicate in multiple languages for multiple audiences. The accident that saved everything was paperwork. Champollion died in 1832, 10 years after his breakthrough, at the age of 41. He had spent those 10 years reading everything he could reach, traveling to Egypt for the first time, standing in front of the walls he had unlocked, reading inscriptions that no living person had read in 14 centuries. Thomas Young died the year before, at 56, having never fully conceded that Champollion's system was correct or that his own early work had been superseded. But what they left behind, what the Rosetta Stone made possible, is one of the great acts of recovery in human history. A civilization that had been silent for 1,400 years found its voice again. Enough to know that the people who built the pyramids were not mysterious, not alien, not symbols of ancient mystical wisdom beyond human comprehension. They were people. They worried about their crops and their children and their gods. They fell in love and wrote about it. They complained about their bosses and taxes. They wanted to be remembered. And because a French soldier hit a rock with a shovel in 1799, they are the most written civilization in the ancient world. Silent for 1,400 years. And what brought them back? Was it a grand expedition or a sacred text or a moment of divine inspiration? It was an accident, a shovel, a broken stone in the dirt. Language is not permanent. It requires living people to carry it. It took another 1,400 years and a stolen stone and 2 brilliant competitive men to get any of it back. Every language alive today exists because someone is still speaking it, still passing it on, still keeping the chain unbroken. That's the thing Airlearn gets right. It doesn't treat language learning as memorization. It treats it as connection. Links in the description if that kind of thing appeals to you. See you in the next one.